There is a ridge in the Arkansas high country that does not appear on any hiking app, on any tourist map, on any sign with a brown wooden arrow pointing the way to a scenic overlook. The old-timers call it Widow's Comb, and they call it that the way you'd say the name of somebody's dead husband at a funeral, quietly, and only when you have to. 3 men walked up that ridge in the autumn of 1931. 3 men who knew the land better than they knew their own reflections. Not one of them walked back down whole. What came down instead were the things they left behind. A satchel hung neatly on a branch, a coffee cup still warm, a rifle standing upright against a tree like someone had simply set it there to answer a call. The sheriff of that county had a rule he never wrote down and never explained. Until the night he sat a young deputy across his kitchen table and said 4 words that would follow her for the rest of her life. Go see the old woman. What that old woman knew had been carried by her family for longer than the county had existed, longer than the state had a name, longer than the road had a number. It was not a story meant to comfort you. It was a set of rules meant to keep you breathing, and even then, only some of the time. Tonight, we walk that ridge together, one careful step at a time, and I promise you this. By the time we reach the tree line, you will understand exactly why some places are not meant to be named, why some voices are not meant to be answered, and why, to this day, there are 3 names carved into a church cemetery in Newton County, with no bodies buried beneath them. Good evening, and welcome back to the fire. If this is your first night sitting here with me in the dark, I tell true accounts of the unexplained. The cases that got a tidy little word stamped on them by a coroner who wanted to go home and nothing more. No embellishment where the truth already does the work. Just the facts, laid out slow, the way they actually happened to the people who lived them. Tonight's account comes out of the Arkansas Ozarks. Out of a hollow the maps are strangely reluctant to name in full, and it centers on a young sheriff's deputy, an old Cherokee grandmother who kept rules older than the county line, and a ridge that, by every account we could find, is still hungry. Before we start, I want to ask you something, because I like to know exactly who's out here with me tonight. Down in the comments, tell me what city, what town, what country you're listening from. I read every single one, and there is something genuinely comforting about scrolling through that list before I go to sleep, knowing how far this fire reaches. If you're new here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because I put out accounts like this one every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. If this story gets under your skin the way I think it will, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells me to keep digging up cases like this one. Now settle in, turn the lights down if you've got the nerve for it, and let's go back to the fall of 1931. Naomi Sawyer had been a sheriff's deputy in that county for exactly 4 months when the first man went missing, and in later years she would say that those 4 months had felt, at the time, like more than enough to know the place. She was wrong about that, though she would not understand how wrong until much later. On a night she rarely spoke of even to people she trusted. She had come up from the flatland south of Little Rock after her husband took a job with the state highway department, that never materialized, and after that fell through, and after the marriage fell through, not long behind it. She had taken the deputy posting in Piney Creek because it was the only opening in 3 counties, and because, if she was honest with herself, she wanted to be somewhere the ground did not remind her of anything. Piney Creek was a town of 400 people, 1 church, 1 general store, and a county office, with a stove that smoked more than it heated. It sat in a bowl of low hills at the foot of a long, dark, timbered rise the locals called Widow's Comb, on account of the way its ridgeline split into 3 jagged points when the light hit it right, like the teeth of an old comb left out in the rain. Naomi had asked early on why nobody hunted up there, why the timber company that owned rights to half the county had never once sent a crew onto that particular ridge. The men in the office had exchanged a look she would come to recognize. Not fear exactly, but a kind of practiced avoidance. The look people give a subject they have long since agreed, without ever saying so out loud, not to discuss. The sheriff, a heavy-set, soft-spoken man named Ellis Boyd Tanner, had simply told her that Widow's Comb was poorer hunting and poorer footing, full of sinkholes where the limestone had worn through, and that a person could break an ankle up there before they ever got a clean shot at anything worth eating. It was a reasonable answer. Naomi, who was a reasonable person, had accepted it. Then, on the 2nd Tuesday of October, a land assessor named Cole Whitfield walked up Widow's Comb to survey a stand of oak for a lumber concern out of Fort Smith, and he did not walk back down. He had told the county clerk he'd be gone 2 nights at most. 2 nights became 4, and 4 became a search party of 6 men who found, on the 5th day, his canvas satchel hanging from the low branch of a blackjack oak, a mile below the ridgeline, on the eastern slope where the afternoon light gave out early. Inside the satchel were his surveyor's tools, untouched, and his field notebook, its final entry written in a steady, unhurried hand that made the words worse, somehow, than if they'd been scrawled in a panic. The entry read only, "Something on the ridge above me, watching. Will note more once I've had a better look." There was no entry after that. Naomi had walked the search line herself that day, and she remembered with a clarity that never dulled no matter how many years passed, the particular quality of the silence up on that slope. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty woods, but a silence that felt attended to, the way a room feels different when someone is standing just behind a door you have not yet opened. By sundown, the search party had come off the mountain without him, and 2 of the 6 men, grown men, men who had hunted that county their whole lives, refused flatly and without further explanation to go back up. Naomi wrote her report the way she had been trained to write it. She called it a probable fall into one of the sinkholes that riddled the limestone beneath the ridge. It was the reasonable thing to write. She did not yet know how little reason would end up mattering. 2 weeks after Cole Whitfield's satchel came down off the mountain, a man named Dewey Rourke went missing from a hollow on the north face of Widow's Comb, and this time there was no reasonable explanation waiting to be written, because Dewey Rourke had not been surveying anything. He had simply been doing what he did every day of his adult life, which was minding his still. Everyone in Piney Creek knew Dewey ran shine out of a stand of hemlock on the north slope, and everyone in Piney Creek had, by long-standing and unspoken agreement, decided that this was not the county's business, so long as Dewey kept selling to people who could hold their liquor and their tongues in roughly equal measure. He was a small, sinewy man in his 50s, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident with a mash paddle years back, with a laugh that carried clean across a hollow on a still morning. His younger brother, Amos, went up every 3rd Sunday, rain or shine, to walk Dewey down to church, a ritual neither of them took especially seriously, but neither of them had ever once skipped in 11 years. Dewey did not attend the service. He sat in the back pew, said it was real nice, without an ounce of conviction in his voice, and walked back up the mountain before the last hymn had finished echoing off the walls. On the last Sunday of October, Amos climbed the north slope and found the still exactly where it always sat, the copper pot, cold beneath its little tin roof. But cold, he would tell Naomi later, in a way that felt recent rather than old. The fire beneath it, banked with fresh ash, not the gray, wind-scattered kind that sits for days. There was a coffee cup on the flat rock beside the fire pit, half full. A thin skin of grounds settled at the bottom, undisturbed by rain. There was a jar of finished shine standing capped and ready on a stump nearby, exactly the way Dewey always left one out for the first customer of the day. There was Dewey's canvas coat, hung neatly from a nail driven into the trunk of the nearest hemlock, as if he had simply stepped away from it for a moment and meant to come right back. There was no Dewey. Naomi went up with Sheriff Tanner himself that time, and she watched him circle the cold still twice, slow, the way a man circles something he already understands and does not want to. He picked the coffee cup up, studied it, and set it back down exactly where it had been sitting, careful, as though returning it wrong might matter to somebody. Then he said, without looking at her, that he wanted her report to read that Dewey had fallen into a sinkhole, and he wanted it written that night before she said one more word about anything else she might have noticed up on that slope. Naomi started to protest, and Sheriff Tanner, a man she had never once heard raise his voice, said only, "Quiet, deputy. You write it, and you don't come back up on this mountain past the middle of the afternoon. Not for me. Not for anybody." That evening, walking back down the fire road in the long gold light before dusk, Naomi found herself doing something she could not fully explain, even to herself, stepping wide around a fallen tree rather than climbing over it, because climbing over it would have put her back briefly to the slope above, and something in her, some old animal sense she had never before had cause to trust, did not want to turn her back on that ridge, not even for the 2 seconds it would have taken to swing a leg over a log. The third disappearance came in the last week of November, and it was the one that finally broke whatever thin membrane of denial the county had been living behind, because it did not involve a man who worked alone in a hollow full of secrets. It involved Silas Enoch, 73 years old, a trapper who had lived on the eastern face of Widow's Combe for close to 40 years, and who was, by every account, one of the most careful men in that entire county. Silas kept 4 hounds. 3 of them were old, gray around the muzzle, content to lie by his stove most days, and only rouse themselves for a short line walk in the mornings. The 4th, a young red and white walker named Scout, was fast enough and sharp-nosed enough to run a bear up a tree before breakfast, and Silas was fond of saying to anyone who'd listen that Scout would outlive him and probably outsmart him too. On the last Friday of November, at first light, all 4 dogs came down off the mountain and into Piney Creek without their owner. They came down the main road together in a tight, silent line, none of them barking, none of them running the way dogs run when they are simply glad to see a town. They stopped in front of the county office and sat down in the frost-covered dirt and did not move. Scout's front paws were bleeding, cut in a dozen places, as though she had run flat out through loose scree, without once slowing down to pick her footing. The other 3 dogs were unhurt, but would not eat, would not drink, would not so much as lift their heads when Naomi crouched down in front of them and said their names one at a time. She put together a party of 5 men that same morning, and they climbed to Silas's cabin, which they found immaculate and undisturbed. The fire in the stove, banked low but tended the way a man banks a fire when he fully intends to return to it before nightfall. His boots sat by the door. His coat hung on its peg. On the table lay a King James Bible, open, spine bent flat, a single walnut resting on the page like a bookmark. Naomi looked down at the verse it had been left open to and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the November air, though she would not, for a long while afterward, tell anyone exactly which verse it was. They found Silas's rifle 100 yards above the cabin, leaning upright against the trunk of a young oak, the way a man leans a rifle when he means only to step aside for a moment, to relieve himself, or to listen to something he's heard moving in the brush. They searched for 3 full days. They found no trace of Silas Enoch, not a boot print, not a scrap of cloth, nothing at all. On the evening of the 3rd day, Sheriff Tanner sat down heavily on a stump above the empty cabin, put his hat in his lap, and told Naomi, in a voice she had never heard him use before, that this was the last time in his life he intended to climb that mountain. Then he told her about the old woman who lived alone in Cold Hollow, on the far side of the county, and he told her, in language that left no real room for argument, that she needed to go and see her. The road out of Piney Creek toward Cold Hollow ran straight and graded for the first mile, then narrowed into a rutted track for the second, and then gave up being a road altogether and became something closer to a suggestion, to wheel-worn grooves through leaf litter that a person could easily lose in failing light. Naomi drove as far as the truck would allow her and walked the rest, the November cold biting through her coat, her breath standing in front of her in pale, deliberate clouds. Cold Hollow was not especially cold, despite its name, but it held a stillness that Naomi noticed the moment the trees opened up around her, a hush that felt less like the absence of sound and more like the sound of something listening. A spring bubbled up clear near the center of the clearing, so transparent she could count the pale crayfish walking along its gravel bottom, and beside it stood a small, square-built cabin with a chimney set true and a young peach tree pruned with the kind of patient, obsessive care that spoke of decades, not seasons. The old woman was on the porch, shelling dried beans into a wide wooden bowl, balanced on her knees, and she did not rise, and she did not smile, and she did not so much as pause the steady rhythm of her hands when Naomi came up the path. Her hair, white and unbound, hung in a single heavy braid down the center of her back. Her face was a map of fine lines, and her eyes, when she finally lifted them, were dark, unhurried, and entirely unsurprised. "You're the new deputy," she said. Her voice was low even, and carried the careful precision of a second language spoken for 80 years, fluent, but never fully at ease. "Ellis Boyd sent you." "Yes, ma'am," Naomi said. "My name is Naomi Sawyer." "I know your name," the old woman said, and went on shelling beans. "Sit." Naomi sat on the porch step. For a long while neither of them spoke, and the only sound in the hollow was the dry rattle of beans dropping into the wooden bowl. Finally, the old woman set the bowl aside, looked past Naomi toward the tree line where the ridge closed in above the hollow, and said, "You've come about the ones who didn't come back down." "Yes, ma'am." "Then I'll ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer." The old woman's eyes settled on her, steady as stone. "Do you want the truth of it, or do you want the peace of the truth that will let you keep sleeping through the night?" Naomi thought about Cole Whitfield's satchel and Dewey Rourke's cold coffee and Silas Enoch's bleeding dog sitting silent in the frost, and she said, "I want the truth." "Then you will not sleep well again," the old woman said. "Not for a long while. You understand that, before I say another word?" "Yes, ma'am." The old woman studied her a moment longer, as though weighing something Naomi could not see, and then rose, slow and unhurried, and said, "Come inside, then. I'll want coffee in me for this." Inside, the cabin was a single close room, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a bed beneath a quilt, stitched from 100 mismatched scraps of cloth. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, dark with years of hearth smoke, working herbs rather than decoration, and on a high shelf sat a woven basket so old it had gone the deep amber color of steeped tea, a thing Naomi understood without being told had traveled a very long way to end up on that shelf. The old woman made coffee slow, deliberate in every motion, and poured a cup for Naomi, but did not drink from her own, only held it in both hands, as though for the warmth of it. "The men who did not come back down," she said at last. "Every one of them was on the ridge after the sun touched the tops of the trees." Naomi turned it over in her mind and found it fit. Cole Whitfield's satchel on the eastern slope, where the light thinned early. Dewey Rourke's fire banked, but freshly cold. The hour Silas Enoch's dogs always ran his line, right at dusk. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "All of them were." The old woman nodded once without any satisfaction in it. That is the first thing to know. It is the oldest rule. My mother taught it to me, and her mother taught it to her, back further than anyone still living can count. You do not set foot on that ridge once the sun has touched the treetops. She went on, and Naomi wrote as she spoke, her pencil moving fast across the pages of her field notebook. You do not answer to your own name after dark unless you can see, with your own eyes, the mouth that is calling it. You do not turn to look at whatever is walking behind you. Not once, not to be certain, not for any reason at all. You carry iron against your skin if you have it, silver if you do not, worn directly on the body and never through cloth or in a pocket. Running water breaks its attention, the old woman said. If you believe something is following you, you cross running water, and you do not look back to see whether it followed you across. You take nothing offered to you on that ridge after dark, not shelter, not fire, not a hand held out to help you over a fallen log. And if it speaks to you, you do not speak back, because silence is the only language it understands as an answer, and the only word you will never live to regret. Those are the rules, the old woman said, setting down her cup. Do you have them? Naomi looked up from her notebook. Ma'am, she said carefully. What is it? What's up there? The old woman smiled then, for the first time, and it was not a warm expression. It was the smile of someone being asked a question so large that only a smile could hold the shape of the answer. That is not a question you want answered, she said. But I will tell you the little of it I'm permitted to say. My people had a word for it, long before your county had a name, long before the roads, long before any of it. I will not speak that word inside a house, and I will not speak it at night. It was here before my people came into this country. We did not carry it with us. It was already walking. Then what is it? Naomi asked. The old woman looked toward the window, toward the dark line of the ridge, just visible above the trees. The mountain, she said. Not the mountain, the way your maps mean it. The mountain, the way the mountain means itself. When it is hungry, it walks. When it wants to know what has come onto it, it walks. And when it walks, granddaughter, it walks on legs, and it wears whatever face will bring you closest before you understand what you're looking at. She held Naomi's gaze a long moment, then added, quieter, if you hear a voice you loved, someone gone, someone you buried, call your name from that ridge after dark. You do not answer. You do not turn. You do not even answer it inside your own heart, where you think no one else can hear you say it. That is the hardest rule, and it is the one the mountain is most patient about teaching. Naomi's pencil had gone still in her hand. Ma'am, she said, how did you know to tell me that? Because everyone has one voice they cannot help but answer to, the old woman said. That is how it calls you. That is how it has always called every single one of them. Now go, Deputy Sawyer, go the whole way home, and do not stop walking until you are inside your own door. 3 nights after she came down from Cold Hollow, Naomi began keeping the rules without ever deciding to. She noticed herself doing it the way you notice a habit only after it's already formed, stepping wide around fallen logs instead of climbing over them, so her back never turned fully to the slope above. She told herself it was nothing. She wore the silver locket anyway, every day, under her collar, where the metal went cold against her skin each morning and then warmed slowly to the shape of her. The call came on the 2nd of December, a little past 4 in the afternoon, radioed in from a farm at the base of the eastern face. A boy of 9, gone from his yard since dinner. Last seen walking toward the tree line with a dog that had come home without him an hour later, agitated and refusing the porch. Naomi drove out alone because Sheriff Tanner was 30 miles south on another call, and because a missing child does not wait for anyone's convenience, not even the mountains. She found the boy's tracks easily enough at first, small boot prints pressed into the frost along a deer trail, and she followed them up, watching the light change over her shoulder without meaning to watch it. Gold, then copper, then the flat gray blue that comes right before dark, finishes a day for good. She was perhaps 400 feet below the ridgeline, further up Widow's Comb than she had let herself go since October, when the boy's tracks stopped at the edge of a limestone shelf and did not continue. The silence came down over her exactly the way it had come down over that mountain before, though she had only heard the stories of it secondhand. A stillness with weight to it, a stillness that felt occupied. The crickets that should have been running in the leaf litter had gone quiet. Even the wind, which had been steady all afternoon, simply stopped, as if someone somewhere had cupped a hand over the whole ridge to listen. Then she heard her name. It came from up the slope, from somewhere in the deepening blue between the trunks, and it was spoken in her mother's voice. Her mother, who had been 11 years in the ground, who had called her in from the yard 1,000 times, in exactly that register, with exactly that small rising lift at the end that meant supper's getting cold. Come on now. Naomi, the voice said, gentle, achingly familiar, close enough that she could almost feel breath behind it. Naomi, honey, it's all right. Come on up here. I need you to see something. Her whole body turned toward it before her mind caught up and stopped her. One full step taken, her flashlight beam already swinging up the slope before she remembered the porch in Cold Hollow, the old woman's steady black eyes, the words you do not even answer it inside your own heart. She planted her boot, dug her fingers into the silver at her collarbone hard enough to leave a mark, and made herself stand exactly still, facing forward toward the shelf where the boy's tracks had vanished, refusing the pull at her spine with everything she had left in her. Naomi, closer now, patient, wounded almost, the way her mother's voice used to get when Naomi was being stubborn as a child. She heard distinctly the specific catch her mother used to get in her throat before a cough, a detail so small, so real, so utterly hers, that for one unbearable second Naomi's resolve came apart at the seams, and her whole body screamed to turn around and see. She did not turn. She said nothing back, not out loud, and not, though it cost her everything she had, inside the locked room of her own heart, and she began walking backward down the slope, one slow step at a time, her light never leaving the shelf of rock in front of her until her heel found the cold edge of the little creek that cut along the base of the ridge, and she stepped into it, boots and all, feeling the shocking bite of the water close around her ankles, and she crossed. Something crossed behind her, too. She heard it unmistakably, a second set of footsteps breaking the same water, half a beat after her own, and felt, for one instant, a warmth pass directly behind her shoulder, close enough to raise the hair on her neck, close enough that later she would swear, to no one but herself, that she had felt breath. She did not look back. She walked the whole way to her truck facing forward, got in, locked the doors with hands that would not stop shaking, and drove down into Piney Creek without once checking the mirror. The boy was found the next morning, a mile east, curled and shivering but alive in a hollow log, with no memory of how he'd gotten there and no memory of anything he'd heard calling him deeper into the trees. Naomi never told a single soul how close she had come to answering. Naomi Sawyer stayed in that county for 11 more years, and she never once set foot on Widow's Combe again after the sun touched the treetops. Not for a call, not for a favor, not for anyone. She wore that thin silver chain every day of her working life, and if you asked her about it, she would only say it had belonged to somebody, and let the sentence end there. The official record for that December still lists the boy's disappearance as a case of a child wandering off and losing his way, and the 3 names from that autumn still sit under a single tidy phrase in the county archive, presumed lost to natural terrain hazard, with 3 empty graves in the Piney Creek churchyard, tended every spring by relatives who stopped expecting an answer a long time ago. Naomi kept her rules for the rest of her career, and she never spoke of that December evening to another living soul. But on the morning after she crossed that creek, before she'd even had her coffee, she found 3 smooth, pale stones arranged in a neat line along the windowsill of her own front door, 40 miles from that ridge, in a house the mountain had never once had a reason to know the address of. And she understood, standing there in her stocking feet in the cold morning light, that whatever had followed her home that night had only let her walk away because it wanted her to know that it could have done otherwise. If this account kept you up tonight, you know exactly what to do. Like it, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you'd have had the strength not to turn around.